Ever get that feeling like the best insights are often the simplest ones? That's kind of what we're diving into today. Timeless economic truths, the kind we often overlook. And you know me, love a good blast from the past. So we're turning to a book from 1946, still shockingly relevant. Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson.
It's really amazing how a book written, what is that, over 75 years ago now, it can still feel so fresh.
Right.
Walter Block, a big-time economist,
Hmm.
he said reading it way back in 63 changed his whole outlook. Talk about staying power.
Food for thought. It's like we've got backstage passes to today's news cycle, but with a vintage twist.
Yeah.
And just a fun fact, Hazlitt, he was a writing machine. Over 10,000 published works. The guy just didn't stop.
Yeah.
But let's get to the heart of this one lesson, shall we? Hazlitt, he kicks things off with this really simple story, the broken window fallacy.
He was a master at using those simple stories, to unpack these complex economic principles. Picture this, right? A kid throws a brick through a baker's window. Total headache for the baker.
Yeah, not exactly a great day for business.
Right.
But hey, at least the glazier gets some work out of it, right?
That's kind of the knee-jerk reaction. That's where the fallacy comes in. We see the immediate benefit: the glazier gets paid to replace the window. What we don't see, what we miss, is what that baker could have done with that money if he didn't have to replace the window in the first place.
Yeah, it's like those economic ripple effects. You can't always see them. You know?
Right.
He might have invested in new ovens or hired another baker. Heck, maybe even just treated himself to something nice. All those possibilities, gone.
Exactly. The broken window, it diverts resources. It doesn't create new wealth, And you'd think this would be obvious. But Hazlitt points out, even seasoned business leaders, they fall for this kind of thinking all the time.
It's so easy to get caught up in what's right in front of you.
It is. And it reminds me, actually, of when the government steps in after natural disasters, rebuilding. It creates jobs, sure. But those resources, they could have been used for something else. Maybe even preventative measures, to mitigate future damage.
Yeah.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
It's so easy to get caught up in the immediate needs and completely overlook that bigger picture.
Absolutely. And Hazlitt, he takes this idea even further. In the next chapter, The Blessings of Destruction.
Okay, now you've really got my attention.
Right. Sounds crazy, right?
Blessings of destruction.
But he asks us to question this assumption, this idea that destruction is always bad for the economy.
Okay, now things are getting interesting. Tell me more.
All right, well, think about it in the context of war, right? Rebuilding after a war, it creates this surge in demand. For labor, for materials, factories get rebuilt, houses go up, all of a sudden, jobs.
Right, lots of jobs.
But Hazlitt, he challenges us to look beyond the surface.
Because those resources had to come from somewhere, right? They don't just magically appear.
Precisely. Building new factories in a war-torn country often means not building them somewhere else. It's a diversion of resources, not a creation of wealth.
So how do we wrap our heads around this?
Hazlitt uses a powerful, almost shocking analogy. He says, if bombing our way to prosperity worked, why not just bomb our own factories?
Whoa. Okay, that's a bit jarring, I'll admit. But it definitely makes you think. He's really challenging us to question some pretty deeply ingrained assumptions about economics, isn't he?
Absolutely. He wants us to see there are always trade-offs, always unseen consequences to consider.
And that leads perfectly into the next big idea he tackles, public works mean taxes.
Mm-hmm.
We see a shiny new bridge or massive dam, and we think progress, jobs.
Right.
But who actually paid for it? And what was the real cost? I'm sensing there's more to the story.
There always is. Hazlitt, he dismantles the two main arguments in favor of public works. One, that they create jobs. And two, well, just look at the benefits once they exist. Let's start with the jobs argument.
Okay, so what's wrong with saying, this new highway created thousands of construction jobs? Sounds good on a campaign poster, right?
Right. But again, it goes back to that idea of diversion, not creation. Every dollar spent on that highway is a dollar that wasn't spent somewhere else. Those construction jobs might have been manufacturing jobs, teaching jobs, countless other possibilities. It's not a net gain of jobs, just a reshuffling.
So it's not as simple as just counting the number of jobs created.
Yeah.
We need to look at the bigger picture, the whole system.
Exactly.
Okay, so what about that second argument, the obvious benefits?
Right. Well, we see the bridge, but what we don't see are all the things that weren't built because of it.
I see.
Maybe those tax dollars could have funded schools, hospitals, or even just stayed in the pockets of taxpayers to invest in their own businesses. Hazlitt's reminding us to always look for what he calls the unseen. It's about recognizing those hidden costs, the things we give up when those resources are allocated elsewhere.
Right, right.
And that leads us right into another crucial concept from Hazlitt. Taxes discourage production. Now, we all know, taxes are necessary, right, to fund government services and all that.
Sure.
But Hazlitt, he digs deeper
Yeah.
into how they can actually discourage people from working, from producing.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, no one likes handing over a big chunk of their paycheck to the taxman.
Right.
But how exactly how do they discourage production?
It boils down to incentives, right. Hazlitt argues that when taxes are high, it reduces the incentive to work, to invest, to take risks. Why work those extra hours if you know a big chunk of your earnings is just going to be, taxed away?
It's like that feeling of, like, what's the point? If I'm not seeing the rewards of my hard work, why bother?
Exactly. And it's not just individuals. It impacts businesses, too. They're less likely to invest in new ventures or expand their operations if they know this hefty tax bill is waiting for them down the road.
Right.
Hazlitt argues that this can have, a real stifling effect on innovation, on long-term economic growth.
It's like it's holding everything back.
Yeah. And this kind of ties into another fallacy he tackles, this idea that government spending can create, free money for the economy.
Yes. The allure of government loans and subsidies. Who doesn't love a handout, right? But I'm sensing Hazlitt has maybe a slightly different perspective.
He certainly does. In the chapter Credit Diverts Production, he reminds us that the government, it doesn't create wealth out of thin air.
Right.
When the government hands out loans or subsidies, it's simply redirecting money that was already in the economy.
So it's not creating new wealth. It's just kind of moving it around.
Precisely. And here's the kicker. Government intervention often favors certain businesses over others.
Meaning those with the loudest voices or the right connections, they might end up getting a bigger slice of the pie, even if they're not, the most deserving or efficient.
Exactly.
It's not always a level playing field.
It's not. And that brings us to a topic that's, more relevant than ever, automation. And the fear that robots are, coming for our jobs.
Yeah.
Hazlitt tackles this head on in his chapter, The Curse of Machinery. And you'll be surprised to hear this fear. It's nothing new.
Wait, people were worried about robots taking their jobs back in 1946?
Oh, absolutely. This fear of technology, of machines displacing workers, it's been around for centuries.
Well,
Hazlitt, he reminds us of the panic that erupted in the 18th century when new spinning machines were introduced in the textile industry.
oh, right.
People feared mass unemployment. But what happened?
I'm guessing it wasn't the economic apocalypse everyone was predicting.
Not even close. The textile industry, it boomed, creating countless new jobs and ultimately, raising the standard of living for everyone.
Interesting.
It's the same story with the rise of the automobile. Sure, it displaced, buggy makers and stable hands.
Right.
But it created millions of new jobs in manufacturing, transportation, all these related industries.
So the key takeaway here, I'm sensing, is that while those advancements, they might cause, some short-term disruptions, in the long run, they often lead to greater prosperity for everyone.
That's the idea Hazlitt's getting at. He wants us to see beyond that immediate fear of job losses, recognize that incredible power of innovation to create new opportunities, a better future. And this brings us to another popular idea he challenges, the notion of spread the work schemes.
Like shortening the work week so that everyone can have a job.
Exactly.
It sounds great in theory, but I'm sensing Hazlitt might see some flaws in that plan.
He does indeed. He lays out two scenarios to illustrate why these schemes, they often backfire. First, if you reduce working hours without reducing pay, you're essentially asking those with jobs to subsidize those without.
Okay.
It's just shifting money around, not creating new wealth.
So not exactly a sustainable solution to unemployment.
Exactly. And the second scenario is even more, problematic. If you reduce working hours and raise pay to compensate, you're essentially just increasing the cost of production.
Which, inevitably, that's going to lead to higher prices for consumers.
Or businesses going bust, right?
Unfortunately, that's usually the case. Hazlitt's point is artificially manipulating work hours, it doesn't address those root causes of unemployment and often makes things worse.
Right. It's not a magic bullet.
No.
Yeah.
And this ties into another fascinating chapter, disbanding troops and bureaucrats.
Okay.
He argues that paying people not to produce, whether they're soldiers or bureaucrats, it's ultimately a loss for society as a whole.
Well, what about those individuals, the ones who rely on those jobs? It's not their fault they were in the military or working for the government.
Absolutely not. And Hazlitt, he's not, demonizing those individuals. His point is that when wartime spending ends or when government bureaucracies shrink, that money, the money that was being used to pay those salaries, it doesn't just vanish.
Right.
It goes back into the hands of taxpayers who can then spend it in, other sectors of the economy, creating new jobs, stimulating growth. So it's about kind of shifting resources from less productive areas to more productive ones.
Precisely. It's about letting the market work its magic and direct resources to where they're most needed. And that leads us perfectly into our next topic, international trade.
Ah, yes. The age-old debate of free trade versus protectionism. I'm ready for some Hazlitt wisdom.
Well, in his chapter, The Drive for Exports, he tackles this common belief that more exports are always a good thing for a country.
Which, I mean, on the surface, it seems intuitively correct. More exports, more money flowing into the country, right?
On the surface, yes, but Hazlitt, he cautions against forcing exports, through things like bad loans or subsidies.
Because, well, as we've already established, those interventions, they often come with a whole bunch of unintended consequences.
Exactly. Hazlitt argues that if a country has to resort to these artificial measures to boost its exports, it's essentially giving its goods away at a discount, which ultimately hurts its own economy in the long run.
Right, it's not a sustainable strategy.
It's not. And that brings us to another classic economic fallacy that Hazlitt debunks. The idea of saving industries that are struggling.
Ooh, I have a feeling this is going to be good.
It's a good one.
Yeah.
In his chapter, Saving the X Industry, Hazlitt, he takes aim at this practice of propping up failing businesses, failing industries, through things like, tariffs, price controls, subsidies.
See, that feels good politically, right, to be seen as a job saver.
Exactly. But Hazlitt, he argues that these, well-intentioned interventions, they ultimately harm the economy as a whole.
By interfering with that natural process of, what do they call it, creative destruction.
Precisely. He argues that for new industries to thrive, old ones need to be allowed to, to decline or even fail.
To make room for the new.
Exactly. This frees up resources, capital, to flow to more productive areas of the economy.
It's like pruning a garden. You have to cut back the dead wood to make room for new growth.
That's a great analogy. So often we try to cling to the old ways of doing things, even when it's clear they're no longer working.
It's human nature, right?
Yeah.
To resist change, especially when it comes to, our jobs, our livelihoods.
It is. But Hazlitt's urging us to embrace that dynamism, the dynamism of a free market, and to trust that creative destruction, while sometimes painful in the short term, ultimately leads to a more prosperous future for everyone.
It's almost like that classic Aesop's fable, the ant and the grasshopper.
Right.
The ant's busy preparing for the future while the grasshopper's just, living for the moment.
Right.
We often celebrate the grasshoppers of the world, but it's the ants who are, quietly laying the groundwork for real prosperity.
That's a great analogy. And Hazlitt, he really drives this point home in the final part of the book, The Lesson Restated. He essentially gives us this cheat sheet for spotting economic fallacies in our daily lives. Oh, I like that. So it's not just a theoretical treatise. It's a practical guide to understanding the economic forces that shape our world. What are some of the key takeaways from this lesson restated?
Well, one of the big ones is the importance of considering the long-term consequences, right,
Oh, yeah.
of economic policies.
Yeah.
Not just that immediate impact.
Right.
He reminds us there's always a trade-off, always an unseen cost to consider. And he brings back that idea of the forgotten man from William Graham Sumner. Remember him?
Refresh my memory.
Right. So the forgotten man, he's essentially the one who bears the brunt of the costs of these well-intentioned but ultimately misguided policies.
Right.
He's the taxpayer who has to foot the bill for, for subsidies, the consumer who faces higher prices because of tariffs, the worker who loses his job because of minimum wage laws.
It's so easy to get caught up in the, the feel-good rhetoric of a policy that promises to help, a specific group, without considering that wider impact on everyone else. Absolutely. And Hazlitt reminds us that we're all, interconnected, this complex web of economic relationships.
Right.
He talks about the division of labor, how we each specialize in producing a particular good or service, and how the specialization ultimately makes us all more prosperous in the long run.
Because when we each focus on what we're good at, it allows us to produce more efficiently
Yeah.
and create more wealth for everyone.
Exactly. But Hazlitt, he also warns this specialization, sometimes it can lead to a kind of a narrow focus where we only see the world through the lens of our own industry or our own job.
Oh, yeah. We've all been there. We want higher prices for the things we sell and lower prices for the things we buy. But we forget that, It doesn't always work that way in the real world.
It's a natural human impulse, but it can lead to, some bad economic policies when we prioritize our own narrow interests over the well-being of the whole. Hazlitt also he challenges us to accept that economic progress. It's rarely smooth, it's rarely evenly distributed. He argues that it's messy, it's dynamic. Some industries are booming while others decline.
It's like that old saying, you can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs. Progress inevitably involves some disruption.
Exactly. And Hazlitt cautions against trying to resist those disruptions,
Oh.
through government intervention. He argues that trying to prop up failing industries or prevent those job losses through tariffs and subsidies, it often does more harm than good in the long run.
It's about embracing the dynamism of a free market, trusting that creative destruction, while sometimes painful, ultimately leads to a more prosperous future.
That's the idea. He wants us to see that change. It's inevitable. And that trying to resist it, it often just makes the pain last longer.
This has been such an eye-opening conversation. It feels like economics in one lesson is more than just a book about economics. It's almost like a guide to thinking clearly about, these complex issues.
I agree. It's a timeless reminder of the power of those simple, timeless principles, right? To cut through the noise, to help us make sense of the world around us.
So what's the one big takeaway? If you had to pick one that you hope our listeners will remember from this deep dive into Hazlitt's work.
For me, it's the importance of questioning assumptions, thinking for ourselves, and being wary of, simplistic solutions to complex problems.
It's about looking beyond the immediate, seeing those long-term consequences of our actions or policies.
Exactly. And remembering that sound economic thinking, it's about understanding those trade-offs, recognizing those unseen costs.
Right.
And always considering the impact on all of us, not just a select few.
Well said. A huge thank you to our expert for guiding us through the intricate and often, let's be honest, counterintuitive world of economics. And to you, our listener, we'll leave you with this final thought from Henry Hazlitt himself. He said, "The art of economics consists in looking not merely at the immediate, but to the longer effects of any act or policy. It consists in tracing the consequences of that policy, not merely for one group, but for all groups." Go. Happy learning.